John Milnes Baker is an award-winning architect who specializes in residential design. He was a 2018 recipient of the Albert Nelson Marquis Lifetime Achievement Award by Marquis' Who's Who in America as a leader in the field of architecture. A fine arts graduate of Middlebury College, Baker received his master's degree in architecture from Columbia University. A longtime member of the American Institute of Architects, Mr. Baker is a member of the Society of Architectural Historians and the National Trust for Historic Preservation. He is the author of How to Build a House with an Architect, Harper and Row, 1988, and American House Styles, A Concise Guide, first published in 1994 by W. W. Norton, but reprinted in expanded edition in 2018. When Better Homes and Gardens magazine Home Plan Ideas featured their 10 most popular houses of all time, 3 of them were Baker's designs, including, quote, our readers' flexible all-time favorite, which they described as one of the most universally accepted houses they had ever featured. Mr. Baker continues to lecture on the history of the American house and continues to consult with residential clients as an emeritus member of the AIA.
John Milnes Baker once again. And now for something completely different. We leave the ancient world of Greece and Rome and enter the Victorian era with the picturesque. From 1835 to our Centennial Celebration in 1876. Very critical and wonderful period. This is part 3 of my history of the American house, and I call it America Comes of Age. And the dates, my buoys of history, are starting in 1835, which ended part 2. And we're going to go to the stock market crash of 1929. It's a very significant age, and a lot of things happened in America in those days, and it's all reflected in the way we live and the houses that we lived in. 1835, 1876, America comes of age. This is sometimes called, well, it's really the picturesque era, but it's often called the Victorian period. And we're going to go up to the Centennial Celebration in Philadelphia. And that was in 1876. So that's the first part of this part 3. And then later on, we'll go on from 1876, and that's when we'll go on to 1929. And I call that the age of expansion. And that's a reminiscent period from the Centennial Celebration in 1929 to the 1929. So the next slide is a very significant buoy of history, and that is Washington Irving's house. Washington Irving was the author of Rip Van Winkle and The Legend of Sleepy Hollow, and he was the first American writer to be recognized abroad. And after living in Europe for many, many years, he returned to New York and back home in 1835, and he settled in Tarrytown, New York, on the eastern shore of the Hudson River, about 25 miles or so north of the city. He bought a generic little Dutch 2-room stone farmhouse and engaged his neighbor painter, George Harvey, to help him remodel the place. He told Harvey, and old Dutch cottages had crow steps on their gable ends. So must mine. It was probably the first time that the word quaint was ever used in a complimentary term for a major house. And so we can go on to the massing was based on an idealized version of an early Dutch farmhouse, steeply pitched roofs with the step gabled ends. There was a vine-covered entrance to which led to basically a fairy tale cottage. But this image is I took a picture in the wintertime when the vines were not good, so you can see it a little bit better. And masonry construction with stucco finish. The clustered flues on the chimney. One bedroom actually featured a sloped ceiling, quote, to be covered with a striped wallpaper to resemble a curtain of a tent, unquote. Well, Sunnyside is extremely modest in scale, 2.5 stories, and to the right of the main house was added, the addition was added in the early 1840s. And there's no question that this house is a buoy of history for the date of 1835, which bridged American residential architecture from the twilight of the classical age to the era of the picturesque. Sunnyside was a turning point in the taste that left the ancient world of Greece and Rome behind and drew from a wide range of precedents from the Gothic era to exotic structures. So our thanks can go to Washington Irving for a new direction, not just in the case in the world of letters, but in the way he changed the whole direction of the American house, American residential architecture. Now, I want to point out one thing in the next slide that you'll see. The front elevation shown in the following illustrations are all copied from my book, American House Styles, A Concise Guide. They are all developed from the same basic parti. And I state in the preface of my book, stylistic embellishments of American houses tend to be superficial veneers that often veiled inventive floor plans and common sense designs for new American living patterns. The quote, content, as distinct from the style, was apt to be more innovative than one might suppose at first glance. The difference between style and content, between the clothes and the person, is obviated by the use of the same floor plan throughout this guide. And these are buoys of history. They're critical dates, and they're all in my book. If you actually end up reading my book, it's from 1835, Washington Irving's Sunnyside, and it happened to coincide within a couple of years of Queen Victoria's beginning. She began her 64-year reign in 1837. And all kinds of wonderful things happened during that period. And I'll be mentioning most of them as we go along through the rest of the talk. The ones we're going to cover in part 3 to start with are the Gothic Revival, Swiss Cottage, Italian Villa, Italianate, Italian Renaissance Revival, Exotic Eclectic, Second Empire Stick, and Queen Anne. And this is the whole picturesque era encapsulated in these particular styles. And they're sometimes called Victorian, but, and we'll end this first part with the Centennial Celebration in Philadelphia. So the first slide we're going to look at is the Gothic. This is the first of the picturesque styles of the Victorian era. The mingled quaintness, beauty, and picturesqueness of the exterior, when harmoniously complete, seemed to transform one back to a past age. The domestic habits, the hearty hospitality, the joyous old sports, and the romance and chivalry of which invested in the dim retrospect with a kind of golden glow in which the shadowy lines of poetry and reality seemed strangely interwoven and blended. Now, how's that for a wonderful Victorian comment? And down at the bottom there, you see Horace Walpole's Strawberry Hill. It's in Twickenham, near London, and it was built in 1750. And Walpole's, there was a whole thing about his house. It was nothing Gothic really about it. It's sort of rectilinear, usually cross gables. Informal and irregular are terms often used to describe the rambling character of these houses. Steeply pitched roofs, prominently featured verge board, cross gables, and wall dormers are typical characteristics. Entrances, usually double doors with decorated glass panels, most often protected by a projecting porch with fanciful Gothic brackets and scrolls. The windows, the fenestration is a mixture of double casements with hood moldings, prominently featured lancet arched windows, most often with diamond pane glass, either typically built of wood frame construction with vertical board and batten siding, or in larger houses, masonry construction with stone um, with flush joints. Chimneys are prominently featured, echoing the fancy patterns of clustered flues in the medieval precedents. And one-story porches are common. Just one last remark about Walpole's fanciful adaptation of the Gothic style, spelled in those days sometimes Gothick, and that marked the beginning of the British fascination for the romance of the past. It usually took several generations in those days for the British architectural taste to reach our shores. And what we're looking at here on the upper left is a cottage for a country gentleman from Downing's The Architecture of Country Houses. It was published in 1842. And here are three wonderful examples of houses that follow Downing's advice. They're often called Downing cottages. Is the William Roch House in New Bedford. That was Alexander Jackson Davis, who was a follower and an advocate of everything that Downing had to say. And there's the Henry Delamater House in Rhinebeck, and the one on the lower right is in Salem, Mass. And the next slide shows the largest, that's Lyndhurst. It's the largest house built in the Gothic Revival style. In 1838, William Paulding, former mayor of New York City, hired noted architect Alexander Jackson Davis, who lived from 1803 to 1892. He got him to design this house in Tarrytown, very, very near Sunnyside. And it's also looking west across the Hudson River. Next slide is one that was near where I lived for 30 years in Bedford, a place called Bedford Corners. And this was one of three wood houses and also designed by Alexander Jackson Davis. The next slide is a little shocking when you see the color, but it's a wonderful example. It's called Roseland, and it's in the northwest corner of Connecticut. It's, note the board and batten siding, oriole window, that's the little window over the window under the major gable there, very steeply pitched roofs, and pinnacle ornaments. And the earlier pictures of this house were shown as typical of most of the houses of that era of the Gothic Revival, never would have been painted this color, as far as I know. And it was more a tawny or earthy color, but it's kind of fun seeing it in this color. It's been beautifully restored and you can visit it. So the next popular style that came along was the Swiss cottage, and that started about 1840 and it went till about 1870. And Andrew Jackson Downing promoted the Swiss cottage style in his Victorian cottage residences. And he said, quote, anyone fond of the wild and picturesque, whose home happens to be in some one of our rich mountain valleys, may give it a peculiar interest by imitating the Swiss. Well, like so many of our house styles in the Victorian era, the Swiss cottage caught on in Britain. In his book, Rural Architecture, or a series of designs for ornamental cottages, the English writer P.F. Robinson recommended the style for residential designs in his book. Queen Victoria actually imported a Swiss cottage in 1853 as a playhouse and had it installed in Osborne, her retreat on the Isle of Wight. For the English, Switzerland was, quote, Protestant and clean. It represented an idyllic land remote from their growing industrialization. Charles Dickens had a small chalet in his garden where there's even a tube stop in London Underground that commemorates an 1840 tavern built in the style near St. John's Wood. And here you'll see in the upper left a picturesque Swiss cottage, and that's actually from Downing's The Architecture Country Houses. The massing is informal with dominant shallow gabled roofs. Porches are an integral part of the whole and are usually kept under the main roof. The entrance, the front or main door was usually set back from the front edge of the porch, and the materials for these houses are invariably made of wood. They are rustic in character and most often board and batten. Asymmetrical, multi-gabled, always. So we have the Swiss cottage in the Swiss manner. Then the next three houses are scattered around. The one on the upper right is in Newport, Rhode Island. The one on the lower left is in Dutchess County, and the one on the right is messed up a little bit, but it obviously echoes the Swiss cottage in the earlier part of that building. So the next popular style of the Victorian era was the Italian villa. Now, Andrew Jackson Downing, in his Victorian cottage residences, which was 1842, said, "An Italian villa may recall to one familiar with Italy and art by its bold roof lines, its campanili, its shady balconies, the classic beauty of that fair and smiling land." Well, the first one built in this style was in 1802. As I say, it was usually a generation or two before the styles in England reached this shore. So Cronkhill, John Nash, who lived from 1752 to 1835, and he designed Cronkhill at Addingham Park in 1802. It was based on the vernacular country styles of northern Italy. The style became increasingly popular in England and soon caught on here, thanks largely to Andrew Jackson Downing's books. Note, the tower is the key feature of this style, and it distinguishes it from simply the Italianate. Some architectural writers conflate the two, but I think they seem in the 1840s, the writers, the promoters of the style separate them, and I prefer to do that. In the upper left, that's from Andrew Jackson Downing's Victorian cottage residence, is 1842, and he calls it, quote, "an irregular villa in the Italian style, bracketed." In the upper right is the Morse House in Portland, Maine. It's a large stone example. And then in the lower, of course, there's a wonderful tower, Italian villa in Amherst, Mass, and then a modest one in Sharon, Connecticut. And the one on the right is a great big house, the King House in Newport. And we have more of these. And on the left, again, from Victorian cottage residences, Andrew Jackson Downing said, "A villa in the Italian style." It was design number 8 in that book. And you can see in the upper right, a house on Hillside Avenue in New Haven, Connecticut, that very much echoes the guidelines, if you will, set forth in the picture in Downing's book. Across the bottom are just sort of at random. One on the left is in Ridgefield, Connecticut. The one in the middle is in Southport. And the one on the right, I happened to be driving by it in Virginia, and I couldn't resist stopping and taking a picture of it. In the next slide, we now go and you'll see this difference between the Italian villa and what we call Italianate. And the Italianate is contemporaneous with the Italian villa, but it does not feature the tower. The style was so popular during that period that it was sometimes called the American bracketed style. It was also called the Tuscan, the Lombard, and simply the American style. And in the bottom there, you'll see a little octagon house. The octagon house is sometimes considered a separate style. However, it's a building type, and it can be designed in any number of styles. There was a wonderful book called The Octagon House, A Home for All, by a wonderful character named Orson Fowler, published in 1848, and it popularized the octagon house for 15 or 20 years, but most of them were treated with Italian details. So the next slide, I'll just describe some of the features that are typical of the massing and configuration of the typical Italianate house is generally simple and straightforward. They could be in a wide variety of forms, but almost always with a disciplined sense of order. The entrance projecting porches were common and usually featured attenuated columns or brackets. Fenestration rarely had small pane divided lights, mostly 2/2, and noticed round-headed windows and also the squat windows. Siding could be anything from stucco to wood siding, and many houses with smooth boards. But the key identifying feature of all Italianate houses are the brackets prominently featured under the eaves. The boxy house with the shallow pitched roof are often capped with a cupola or a monitor. The attic walls often extend a few feet above the attic floor, allowing room for low windows. These are wonderful houses that they can be very plain, like the one in the upper left, and that's in Litchfield, Connecticut. And then down below that is the perception is that it's a flat roof with a cupola or monitor. So the house in Morristown, New Jersey, it's really kind of an eclectic jumble. And then on the lower right, there's a house in New Haven. And wherever you go, you can spot these houses, and it's usually the two things, either the monitor, the lantern-like thing at the top, or the brackets. So then let's go to the next slide, and it'll be the next types. And it's Italian Renaissance revival. It covers the same period, but not all houses have to be quaint to be picturesque. Now, the Travelers Club in London's Pall Mall was designed by Sir Charles Barry. It served as a prototype for this formal style. New York's India House is a landmark example of a freestanding building, and there are rows of brownstones designed in the style. But I didn't have a picture of the India House, but that post office in Georgetown, Washington, D.C. was originally a custom house, but it also very much, they all pretty much have the same character. And so the next slide, some of the characteristics. Simple, symmetrical flat surfaces, rectangular structures with windows aligned both vertically and horizontally. Shallow pitched roofs, sometimes almost imperceptible as pitched roofs from the ground. Formal only in the part of the building to feature columns at the entrance. The entrance porch projects a few feet from the face of the building. It's common, but not always the case. They're almost often exclusively masonry, and they featured small, smooth stone service, brick, or stucco finish. And simple classical pediments above the windows and doors. Classical cornices were generally determined by the height of the roof line. Same ratio as the column height to cornice base with a lower width of the column that we examined when we looked at the Georgian era. And generally a minimum of classical details, restrained in character, though not picturesque, just as much the legitimate Victorian style. And let's see a couple of examples as we travel around the country. Here's one, and there's an example in Providence, Rhode Island, and then on the right is Salem, Mass. And across the bottom, there are rows of brownstones in New York, and these three happen to be in Brooklyn, and they very much exemplify the character with classical references. The next style is exotic eclectic. And here we have at the lower part there, again in England, earlier in the century, Brighton was built by John Nash designed by him in 1818, the Royal Pavilion, and Sizingcote was in Gloucestershire. And the massing is complex, fanciful, whimsical, and irregular in the extreme. The roof type, usually a mixture of a variety of roof types, domes, entrance often accentuated with Syrian, Egyptian arches, or bizarre combinations. Fenestration standard units, but often combined in whimsical ways. The materials may be masonry, brick, or wood, or a combination of all three. The details highly decorated based on obscure precedents. Miscellaneous turrets, domes, octagons, and any and all are usually in place. So let's look at a couple of examples of this. On the left is an octagon. It was a house originally designed and built in 1860 by Paul J. Armour, a New York financier, as a two-story octagon along the lines of Orson Fowler's 1853 book, The Octagon for All. And Steiner had the house remodeled, and there's a wonderful description of it in the American Architecture, Westchester County, New York, by Frank Sanchez, as a fantastic embodiment of the Vogel's Second Empire. But on the upper right is probably the apotheosis of this fanciful design. That's Olana for the famous painter Frederick Church's house in Hudson, New York. But again, you can spot these as you drive around. The two at the bottom, the one on the left is in Savannah, Georgia, and the one on the right is in San Francisco. The next slide, and you'll see I spotted that in Sag Harbor, Long Island. Couldn't resist getting out of the car. I almost got run over. And the Egyptian columns in New Haven, Connecticut, and this wonderful building that was never finished, but it was Longwood by Samuel Sloan. It was near Natchez, Mississippi. And it was a wonderful example of exotic eclectic. Now, let's go to the next slide, which will show the Second Empire, which started in about 1860 and went for about 20 years to about 1880. And Richard Morris Hunt was the first American to study at the École des Beaux-Arts in Paris. Napoleon III, who was Napoleon Bonaparte's nephew, transformed the old city to the city of grand boulevards and set the fashion for this new style. And you can see on the lower part there, the mansard roof configurations. They were named for the 17th century architect Francois Mansart, S-A-R-T, who lived from 1598 to 1666. Now, the massing of these houses generally axial in their layout, often with cruciform layout plan. The identifying feature of this style, of course, is the mansard roof, a double-pitched hip roof. The lower steep section usually has dormers, often very large, typically centered with the entrance is centered with a projecting porch. Double glazed doors are very common. Windows most often large double hungs, 1/1 or 2/2, rarely multi-pane. Materials can be anything, clapboard, stucco, and sometimes masonry. Shares some details with the Italianate and Italian villa styles. The eaves are commonly defined by substantial moldings supported by Italianate brackets. And it always puzzled me that the official architectural style of an authoritarian government would appeal to Americans. However, a mansard roof seems perfectly natural on a rural New England farmhouse. There's some wonderful examples. The Tome Higgins house in Greenwich. Down below that, it's another wood house. It was very near his. It's all in the same family, but the other one we looked at was the early Gothic revival. This is mansard. And then it just sort of at random, you drive along, you see these houses all the time. I always been likened by some people as a sort of bird watcher, but I'm a house watcher instead. I hope you will too. The initial picturesque styles were Gothic revival, the Swiss cottage, and the Italianate styles, and they all found impetus in European precedent. American architects soon created a new style that sought character from complexity of form and an inventive expression of structure. Gervais Wheelers wrote a book called Rural Homes. It was published in 8 editions between 1851 and 1869 and did much to promote the style. And also Henry Cleveland captured the essence of this new and energetic way of building in his 1856 book, Village and Farm Cottages. And he said the strength and character of the new style depends almost wholly on the shadows which are thrown upon its surface by projecting members. Cleveland did not use the term stick style. That term was coined later by Yale professor Vincent Scully, who also, 100 years later, and he was the one also that term shingle style. So let's take a look at some of these. The general, it's a Griswold house in the upper left. Mark Twain's house in Hartford. Lower left was a house that's since been painted white, which is a shame, but I took this picture a long time ago in New Canaan. And then the picture on the right, lower right, is in Newport. And generally rectangular footprints, often cruciform plans, broad porches were an important part of the composition. Front entrance usually recessed back from a gable porch roof, double hung or casement windows, wood frame construction, generally mostly clapboard. And the celebration of structure with decorative trusses at the apex of the gables, the principal feature of the stick style of the pattern of heavy wood boards, vertical, horizontal, or diagonal, that suggests a structural framework beneath the clapboard skin. However, this is usually illusory. The actual structure is typically balloon frame construction, which was common use in the 1850s. And if we go to the, you'll see that's a wonderful classic example of the stick style house. It's in Stony Creek on the water in Connecticut. If you look at just in the middle of the 3 on the left, that's also in Stony Creek. And there you can see what Gervais Wheeler was getting at. And then you see these wonderful little small examples. It's tiny house in New Haven and another one in Madison, New Jersey. They're not as elaborate by any means, but they are indeed stick style. The characteristics of this, the core of these houses is typically a substantial cube from which wings project at both the second floor as well as the ground levels. The roof type, a central core may well have a hip roof, sometimes in the case of large houses with a flat roof deck at the top. The projections may have a variety of roof types, but more often than not, lower and often cone-shaped roof. Entrance usually under a projecting porch, which sometimes extends across the entire facade. Materials are usually clapboard, but may well incorporate panels or sections with scalloped shingles or fan-like patterns of clapboard. Spindles are a distinguishing feature, particularly under the lintels of porches. Also, fanciful carved brackets are common. I always thought this was kind of the quintessential house of the Norman Rockwell's America. And at the lower left there is a William Watt Sherman house. It was in Newport, Rhode Island. It was designed by Henry Hobson Richardson in 1874. It's often considered the, quote, first American Queen Anne house. So just for another glimpse at some of these, there's the William Watt Sherman house on the left. The upper right is not far from me. It's in Lime Rock, Connecticut. I drive past it fairly often. I always slow down. And across the bottom, there's sort of the typical examples. And take a look at the next slide. There's several more, and you'll see that the characteristics are often featured, but not necessarily. The tower. And the upper right is an unusual one. Sometimes I've seen pictures of that house lumped in as chateau-esque, but I really think of it more as a masonry example of a Queen Anne. Now take a look at the next slide and you'll see a wonderful example. The William Carson House in Eureka, California. It was begun in 1884 for Samuel and Joseph Newsom. And that's a wonderful example of Queen Anne. Now we're going to begin the second half of this period, which goes from 1876 to the 1930s. And this is what we call the other was a picturesque era. This is the reminiscent era. From the Centennial Celebration in Philadelphia in 1876 through the teens and 20s, the Depression years, and World War II. So we're going to look at the early colonial revival, Dutch colonial, Elizabethan, Spanish mission, Pueblo, Spanish colonial revival in Monterey, and French rural. And we have a lot to cover, so we'll move along. Here's an example of, it's a retrospective view of late Georgian and federal styles, but great liberties were taken in terms of scale, massing, and proportion. These early colonial revivals did not try to replicate the actual colonial prototypes. Really, the first major early colonial revival house was by McKim-Mead and White, and that's not surprising. It's in Newport, and unfortunately, it was torn down. But the massing generally rectilinear and axial, more akin to Queen Anne style than any late 17th century houses. All types of roofs were incorporated in these structures: hip, gable, gambrel. The front entrance was usually given prominence, usually featured high sidelines with either rectangular transom or a fan line based on federal designs rather than the actual colonial era. Double hung windows, but often with divided lights on the upper sash and single pane below. The units were set in pairs with heavy mullion between. This was never seen on original colonial houses. Palladian windows were very much in evidence. Bay windows, rectangular or bowed, were common. Typically wood frame with clapboard siding. Copies of the late 18th and early 19th century details, but no regard for accuracy or authenticity. That will come a few years later. These houses would never be mistaken as an actual colonial or federal structures. So let's look at a couple on the next slide. You can see a mixture there. And the one on the upper right is probably the early example, and you can see it's kind of a mixture of all kinds of things. The lower right is a later and it's a typical four-square structure, and you see that in a lot of suburban houses. And you'll see some other examples. The house in the upper left is in Katona, New York, where I lived for 30 years. And I was asked to put an addition on the back, and I honored everything that was in the original. Across the bottom, some more sort of typical early colonial revival with no regard for any building that actually looked like that in the colonial era. Now let's go to the Dutch colonial, which comes next. And this Dutch, note the difference in that little picture in the middle of the roof pitches. The English were the two slopings of a Dutch, or a gambrel roof rather, pretty much the same. The Dutch had a flare, very short at the upper part, steeper, and often had that flare, and you can see it in Mount Julian, a wonderful example. Let's go to the next slide, and you'll see a few examples. The massing, again, is rectangular plans are designed to appear one story. These houses invariably have gambrel roofs, so that is the nature of this reminiscent style. There's a distinctive flare of the roof at the eave line, giving the house its Dutch character. Entrance, usually simply a simple porch with slender columns supporting simplified adaptation of a federal pedimented porch with a fairly shallow roof pitch. Often these houses were wood construction, but sometimes have a masonry base, either stone or brick. Early Dutch houses used shingles for siding more than the New England settlers, and they sometimes coped the bottom of the shingles, and it created a sort of scalloped effect. Paneled shutters, as opposed to blinds. Blinds are the louvered ones. Shutters are technically paneled or boards, were characteristic of the Dutch colonial house. They were pierced sometimes with decorative holes in the shape of pine trees or bells or half moons. And some scholars simply don't agree whether the characteristic roof was an adaptation of a Flemish farmhouse or was an original type developed here as an amalgamation of several colonial building patterns borrowed from the English. And so let's go on to another English inspired, and it's the Elizabethan. And these were popular from about 1910 to through the Depression years. Queen Elizabeth died in 1603, and she was the daughter of Henry VIII and was the last of the Tudors. And generally, almost any front gabled house with a steeply pitched roof, gable roof, and a large chimney is called Tudor. But this prototype for these half-timbered houses was the cottage rather than the manor house. So I've always felt it more appropriate to call these Elizabethan and save the term Tudor for masonry structures, which we'll see in a little while. And the lower example is Anne Hathaway's cottage near Stratford upon Avon. Generally, the rectilinear with cross gable, steeply pitched gable, similar to New England colonial 17th century houses. Usually a prominent feature with a heavy timber porch. Fenestration, more authentic examples have diamond pane leaded glass, but many simply have casement with multi-pane divided lights. The houses tend to be stucco with applied decorative boards. The prototypes were heavy timber post and beam structures similar to our early New England colonials. Large chimney stacks, sometimes with clustered flues, and these picturesque houses have more in common with early New England house. They share the same genes. Both are styles from the late medieval period and the origin. And I couldn't resist this picture at the lower right. I'll let it speak for itself. Now, the Spanish mission comes next, and that started about 1890, and it went through the 1920s. The mission style started in California when it was adopted by the Santa Fe and Southern Pacific Railway for their stations and resort hotels. And just as architects and designers in the East were looking to their past for precedent for colonial revival work, so did their counterparts in the West. They found inspiration in the Spanish architecture of the Southwest. The popularity of the style spread after the Panama, California Exposition in San Diego in 1915. However, it was just one of several Spanish styles that gained popularity during the early years of the 20th century. And note the typical Baroque parapet or wall dormers seen in the Spanish mission churches throughout the Spanish territories in the West. And we'll look at a couple of these in the next slide, examples. The massing is generally rectilinear with a simple core, most symmetrical with center axis delineating the front door. Most often these houses were three-ranked, entrance door flanked by large bays. The entrance is centered on the distinguishing mission feature of the roof, but a smaller one-story porch sometimes echoes the one on the roof level. Fenestration windows generally double hung with divided lights in the upper sash and a single pane below. The characteristic material is stucco, which can be the wood on a wood frame or house, or masonry with a rendered finish. Besides the distinguishing curved wall dormer, the details tend to be simple, perhaps exposed rafter tails or simple consoles under the soffit. The term Spanish mission should not be confused with Gustav Stickley's mission furniture, featured in the Craftsman magazine, which we'll examine in a little while. Mission furniture was an arts and crafts style developed in the early 1900s and promoted by craftsmen and manufacturers who had, quote, a mission to simplify and improve furniture design. The Pueblo began in the end of the 19th century. The first major house was designed for Phoebe Apperton Hearst by J.C. Schweinfurth in Pleasanton, California. In 1898, it was called a Hacienda de Pozo de Verona. These houses were based on the Palace of Governors in Santa Fe. And you'll note two characteristics, well, flat roofs, number one, because the original Pueblos were flat roofed, and the vigas, the ends of the roof beams or poles that support the roof. And the canales, that little picture on the lower right, they're projecting scuppers that are designed to carry the rainwater away from the face of the building. Simple block compositions. You can go to the next slide as I read. Simple block compositions with characteristic flat roofs. The original Pueblo buildings were constructed with adobe walls, which supported poles or tree saplings. The ends were allowed to protrude beyond the face of the wall. Then a layer of smaller wooden poles or saplings were laid as a mat on top of the larger beams. And then the whole roof was encased in a clay, which hardened in the southwestern sun. The entrance, the main approach to the front door, is often through a courtyard, sometimes quite small, but served as a transition from the hot and dusty outside to a cool and pleasant interior. Windows can be of any sort: casement, awning, double hung. French doors provided access to inner courtyards and gardens. In recent times, of course, large sliding doors have replaced the French doors. The traditional material was adobe block with a coating of clay. Adobe is simply a sun-dried clay brick. But as you can see here, the upper left is a house near Santa Fe, and then just below it is Sedona, Arizona. The other three are all really modern interpretations of the style, and particularly the lower right, the largest one, how it is such an integral part of nature, the integral part of the terrain and the site. And here you're with Spanish colonial revival. As I say, it started about 1915 and went through the whole period of the Depression. And it was again the 1915 Panama, California exposition in San Diego, which was designed by Bertram Grosvenor Goodhue, who lived from 1869 to 1924. It was an influential proponent of Spanish colonial architecture adapted to the 20th century. The climate and cultural heritage suited the Southwest, California, Arizona, New Mexico, Texas, and Florida. And one of the, what we gained from this was the one-story so-called ranch house. So let's look at a couple of examples. The original Spanish colonial houses were adobe and were one-story, typically one-story with red tile roofs. They were typical. The prototypes were simple forms, subtly embellished at the main doorway with ornamental ironwork, often serving as a protective barrier. The revival houses did not emphasize the ornamental ironwork. Door tended to be heavy wood, often with round tops. The finishes on these houses were always stucco. The framework could be either wood frame or masonry. Arches were common with simple details. The most lasting legacy of this revival style was the one-story house that you had a glimpse of a minute ago as the ranch house. There's still another Spanish house called the Monterey style, and that was 10 years before gold was discovered at Sutter's Mill in California. Yankee merchants were sailing around Cape Horn and trading with the Spanish along the southern Pacific coast. There was a lively trade in hides and tallow. San Diego, Santa Barbara, and Monterey became important ports. San Francisco, not until the gold rush of 1849. And Thomas Larkin, a Boston merchant, built this house you see in the bottom there on the lower left in Monterey in 1837. It blended the two basic two-story New England house with a Spanish adobe construction. In the 1920s, the nation's search for colonial precedent led to a revival of the Monterey styles, so they can now be found anywhere across the country. And let's look at a couple in the next slide. Always two-story, usually simple rectangular shapes with cross gable, but the second floor balcony is the inherent component of this style. Roofs tend to be gabled, but sometimes are hip. They are generally covered with wood shingles instead of tiles. Entrance is usually under the second floor balcony without any particular ornamentation. Materials, usually stucco. Basic structures were no longer adobe, but generally standard wood frame. The second floor porches are usually suspended from the extended roof, but may sometimes be supported by posts. Spanish houses were always one story. These new two-story featured interior fireplaces, kitchens, and glazed windows, and were all new to the California landscape. Now, the last of these in this group that we're looking at here was the French rural, and sometimes called a manoir, and the style should not be confused with the so-called French provincial furniture. It was exceptionally fancy and nothing akin to this particular style. Americans who studied at the École des Beaux-Arts in Paris in the 19th century studied classical architecture, particularly the grandiose classicism associated with the school. As the revival styles caught on here before the First World War, the rural vernacular architecture of French countryside became an important inspiration for residential architecture. That little house on the bottom there is in West Mount Airy, Pennsylvania, just outside of Philadelphia. It was designed by Mellor, Meigs, and Howe, who were very important Philadelphia architects. And if you see the next slide, country life in America first appeared in 1901 and continued as a popular magazine through the 30s until the outbreak of World War II in 1941. And it's the picture on the right is from Normandy Village in Chestnut Hill, Philadelphia. It's noted for its French rural houses. And the firm of Mellor, Meigs, and Howe promoted the style in the 1920s. And that country life is wonderful. That house is actually a Mellor, Meigs, and Howe house. Rectilinear plans, often with rounded or octagonal towers, were prominently featured. Steeply pitched roofs, either hipped or gable, and most often with a distinctive flare at the eaves. Entrance usually prominently featured, sometimes within the tower. Casement windows are the most common, often subtle, gently curving arches. Louvered blinds are the most always present, mostly. Stone is most common construction, but occasionally brick is used. Stucco is common, but generally on a block or rough masonry base. Details, the ornamental ironwork was an integral part of the French rural houses, sometimes particularly true in Philadelphia, where the firm of Samuel Yellen Ironworks was famous for its ornamental ironwork. Balconies, brackets, decorative motifs enriched the imaginative designs of the building boom of the 1920s. Now you wonder about that little house in the upper right. That's near Killingworth, in a back road in Killingworth, Connecticut. I was driving along and I almost ran into a tree. I screeched to a halt, and it was a little gem. I believe it was a Frank Forster design, but you can see a combination of stone and stucco and brick, but the tower gives it away. And I was invited in and shown all through the house. It was tiny in scale, but just as much an example of the French rural style. But it was not always that small. If you look at, there's another thing about this whole period. This is a house in Gladwin, Pennsylvania, and it's not far from Philadelphia. The architects of these regional houses found in simple rural architecture prototypes for the 20th century. Normandy farmhouses, or the vernacular houses of the English Cotswold, were much more at home on our shores than were Greek or Roman temples, Oriental harems, or spaceships from another galaxy. Why? Because they were of the land and were simple and direct vernacular solutions to similar architectural problems. So let's look at the last slide in this part. And there we see India Spring, the Busk House on Ocean Drive in Newport, Rhode Island, by Richard Morris Hunt in 1891. And again, I just love the way these houses become such an integral part of the landscape. And I took this from just from the road, and it was just a glimpse of it. And that's the end of part 3. And just to give a hint of what's going to come next in the post-World War II period, from 1929 through the post-war period, but we'll go back to 1876 to 1900, the Gilded Age in the era of palatial palaces. Then again from 1876 to the 1920s, the colonial revival, the different sort. This is the other was the early colonial revival. But this is a reaction to the excesses of the late 19th century. And then the beginning of the modern movement from the late 19th century through the 1929 stock market crash and the Great Depression. 1945 to 1960s, post-World War II era, and possibly we'll have a brief review of residential designs from the 60s to the turn of the 21st century. In other words, from 1960 through 2000. And I look forward to doing that soon. And that's the end of part 3. I hope you enjoyed it, and I hope you continue to look at architecture as you drive around the country. It's a wonderful, rich world. I love birds, but I find house watching much more interesting. Thank you very much.